All right, here we are. Welcome to the MS in Architecture, Computational Technologies. I am Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa. I'm the director of the program at the New York Institute of Technology in New York. One second, I have the, sorry, I have the, yeah. And we have today the honor and the pleasure of having Mario Gandelsonas being a part of our spring 2022 semester lecture series. The lecture series this semester is different from previous ones. We are focusing on the relationship between architecture theory and the relationship between different types of computation specifically addressing the relation between culture and technology in architecture, which is so problematic and is going through so many reconsiderations because of the disruptive innovation of different technologies and different ways of processing information. One of the reasons I wanted to invite Professor Mario Gandelsonas from Princeton University to this lecture is that I believe that we are in a moment in which architectural theory is almost not present at the current discussion in several, at least in several architecture schools around the world. I think that there is a lack of architectural theory in relationship to the way that new innovation in different types of technologies, such as computation, is taking over and replacing architectural discourses through discourses that had to do with other disciplines. So I think in that sense, it is necessary today to reconsider the relationship between architectural theory and the influence of computation in architecture and urbanism today. The lecture today, Mario Gandelsonas, is the architectural theory keynote lecture. So I'm happy to also introduce a new title to our lecture series. And the idea was to actually have a record of Mario Gandelsonas' influence on the relationship between linguistics and architectural theory. I believe that computation and the intrinsic relationship between computation and mathematics is indeed problematic, especially because we can think mathematics as a form of language. And that's what's being discussed, especially today with artificial intelligence and the disruption of the relationship between symbolic computation and data science. In that sense, I have to say that Mario Gandelsonas was one of these very important and influential characters and professors that actually brought to the United States a discourse on linguistics that was actually not really present in the architectural field, at least at the time that Mario introduced it to architectural discourse. There were very few people dealing with that, and I think that Mario is responsible for one of the most important influences of that type of theory in architecture. Specifically, I would like to discuss today with Mario after his presentation the relation between sign and signifier in relationship to digital signifiers, and maybe there is a chance to think about that relationship in a different way. I'm going to briefly introduce Mario formally. The lecture title is The Architectural Signifier, which I believe is based on a seminal text that Mario wrote a while ago that I think is actually very important to revisit today. Architecture seen as complex secondary signifying system involving 2- and 3-dimensional representations is supported by language. It is related to its categories, but with its own organization and specific logic. It is accessible through the subject's discourse, the architectural discourse, and supported by architectural drawn and built text. Mario is going to present a brief description of the notion of signifier as it first appears in structural linguistics, and then how it is borrowed and transformed in other fields, such as structural anthropology and psychoanalysis, to finally discuss the notion of architectural signifier. We recommended the students the following bibliography that I would like people to consider also: The Urban Text by MIT Press, Ex-Urbanism by Princeton Architectural Press, Gandelsonas, Mario, and Morton on Reading Architecture and Progressive Architecture, 1972, Gandelsonas Mario, the Architectural Signifier, paper presented at the first Congress of the International Association of Semiotic Studies in Milan, 1974, and other texts such as Linguistics and Semiotic Models in Architecture and Basic Questions of Design Theory, New York, North Holland, 1975. Mario Gandelsonas, FAIA, is an international recognized theorist, teacher, and designer. As a theorist, he introduced and developed a post-structuralist approach that influenced a generation of theoreticians and historians. He was a fellow at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies and a founding editor of Oppositions magazine. Mario Gandelsonas is a professor at the Princeton University School of Architecture, where he is the director of the program in urban studies and the co-director of the Mellon Initiative in Architecture, Urbanism, and the Humanities. As a partner of Agreste and Gandelsonas, he has designed and built houses, buildings, and urban projects in the US, Argentina, Europe, and China. His articles and designs have been widely published in international and national magazines. His books include The Urban Text, Agreste and Gandelsonas, Works Ex Urbanisms, Architecture and the American City, Shanghai's Reflections, In the Search of Public Gardens, City-State, and Fluvial Metropolis. Thank you, Mario, for being with us, and it's an honor to host you here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Pablo. It's also a pleasure for me to have this possibility of a conversation with you and your students. So I'm going to start this presentation with dealing with the notion of signifier as it appears in structural linguistics before I focus on the notion of signifier within the discipline of architecture. What authorizes this transfer of notions to architecture is semiology, a science of the signifying practices first proposed by de Saussure in his course of general linguistics, first published in 1916, developed in the 60s by, among others, Roland Barthes, Umberto Eco, and Julia Kristeva. If we're going to talk about the signifier, we have to start with the question of language as an object of study, where the notion of signifier was first defined. I will start with a few basic concepts in de Saussure and in his course of general linguistics, who in this first book, or only book, define the notions of langue versus speech. And I'm going to use the French term because we don't have an equivalent in English. That is, the French have what we call language. The French have two different terms, language and langage and langue. So the first one refers to, for instance, different national languages. The second one is the one that Saussure adopted for his theory. So I'm going to discuss the notion of langue versus speech, the notion of signs, signified, and in particular, the notion of signifier. I will then proceed to deal with these notions within architecture considered as a signifying system, based on a paper written a long time ago, as Pablo mentioned, where I first discussed the notion of architectural signifier. So langue versus parole, which is the French terms for language versus speech, this dichotomy is central in de Saussure's theory. De Saussure started with a consideration of the heterogeneous nature of language, which appears at first sight as unclassifiable. At the same time, a physical, a physiological, a mental, an individual, and a social fact. So let me see if I can move this, which is, I think, frozen. Okay, so this is the de Saussure's book, translated to English, obviously. These are the terms that he proposes: langue versus parole, language versus speech. And in this dichotomy, de Saussure started with a consideration, as I said, of the difficulty of defining the essence of language. From the apparent disorder of language, he extracted a pure social object, a systematic set of conventions necessary to communication, which he called lang, as opposed to which speech, parole, covers the purely individual part of language. Speech is essentially a combinatory activity of recurring signs and not a pure creation. And this is actually interesting to us because, as I will discuss later, there have been situations in architecture where we're actually been trying to reduce design to a pure combinatory activity. Lang is at the same time a social institution and a system of values. It is the social part of language. The individual cannot by himself either create or modify it. It is essentially a collective contract which one must accept in its entirety if one wishes to communicate to something else, to someone else. Language is also the basis for social communication. There is no society without language, nor society without communication. Language is produced to communicate in social exchange. Language could be seen as the process of communicating a message between at least two speaking subjects, one of whom is the sender, the other one the receiver. Since the speaking subject is capable of sending a message and deciphering it at the same time, in principle, the sender cannot emit anything that he or she cannot decipher. The message emitted by the one who's speaking, intended for the other, is leading us into the complex realm of the subject, and in particular because of this relationship between the self and the other, which are intrinsic to language. So now let's move on to the notions of sign, signified, and signifier, still within the Saussure's theory of language. For the Saussure, the belief that the linguistic sign associates a thing and a name is an illusion. That is this sort of immediate sense that when we say column, we're associating the word column to a real column. Instead, in his theory, the sign is a psychological reality with two sides. The concept and the sound image, not the sound itself. You know, when I say column, obviously you hear a sound, but that's not what the Saussure intended for the sign. Actually, for the Saussure, the word column, its sign consists of what he calls the sound image column, and the concept column that represents what's common to thousands of columns. The two sides of the sign, described as the two sides of the same piece of paper by Saussure. That is, when I said column, he compares that to a piece of paper in the sense that this piece of paper has two sides, but they are part of the same thing. And those two sides are called the signified and the signifier. The object excluded from this relationship is called the referent, and it's not a concern of linguistics. Lang is considered a formal system that submits to laws and is made of ordered and transformational structures. Although we associate the sign with the word as a minimal unit of language, the word can be broken down into smaller elements. For instance, what are called the morphemes that carry signification as well. Like, for instance, in the word unreadable, you could see that it's made out of three pieces. Un, which means not, read, which is about reading, which is the root of the word, and then able, which means can be done. So unreadable makes a single word that includes what is called three morphemes. On the other hand, the signification of the word is never complete unless it is studied as part of the sentence and within discourse, that is considering the enunciation of the speaking subject. I'm, in this case, the speaking object of this discourse that I'm presenting to you. In this course of general linguistics, the Saussure postulated the existence of a general science of signs, or semiology, of which linguistics would form only one part. Semiology, therefore, aims to take in any system of signs, not just language, whatever their substance and limits are: images, gestures, musical sounds, objects, spaces, and the complex association of all of these, which form the content of ritual, convention, public entertainment. These constitute, if not languages, at least systems of signification, or what he called signifying systems. So now that I presented the notions that I'm going to discuss within architecture, the notion of language, the notion of sign, the notion of signified and signifier, which actually are the two sides of what is an indivisible sign in language, we can move on to architecture as a signifying system. Now, this is a vast subject. So here, since we have very limited time and we want to focus on some specific notions, I'm going to refer to two issues, two questions. First, architecture as a complex signifying system, which actually includes a verbal system, a visual system, and a haptic system. And in a way, I'm trying to illustrate this with this image where you could see a linguistic signifier column, the drawn column, and the object column. So first I'm going to deal with this, what we could call the tripartite nature of the units of architecture and architecture itself as a signifying system. And second, I want to refer to 4 moments in the long history of the architecture discipline where different discourses were enunciated, proposing different subjects and different conceptions of the signifier. So one is going to be, I would say, more like a synchronic view of architecture as a signifying system. And the other one is going to be a diachronic view through time of the signifying system. So architecture, as I mentioned, is a complex secondary signifying system. Obviously, I'm referring to implying that the language is a primary signifying system. So architecture involves 2- and 3-dimensional representations supported by language, related to its categories, but with its own organization and its own specific logic. It is accessible through the subject's discourse, the architectural discourse, and supported by architectural drawings and built texts. Architecture presents very complex and condensed signs, as opposed to the simpler signs of language. Signs that have usually several meanings defined by their context. These are not signs in the way in which they present themselves, nor in the way they function in the Saussure's So we are in a way borrowing the term sign. They're not signs like the ones communicated in the enunciations of discourse, like the signs that I'm verbalizing now in my presentation. They don't function as two sides of the same piece of paper. Instead, they present a relative autonomy of the signifier, which slides under a signified in a chain of signifiers. And this is a crucial, major difference, I would say, between architecture as a signifying system and language. So, when I mentioned four different, I mentioned that I was going to discuss two different issues. The first one related to the tripartite nature of architecture, and the second one about four moments of the architectural discourse. I was more specifically talking about these four books, these four discourses. The first one by Alberti, which we could consider the foundation of the discipline of architecture. The second one by Palladio, the four books. The third one by Durand, Jean-Nicolas Louis Durand, the Précis des leçons d'architecture. And the fourth one, Precisions by Le Corbusier. And I'm going to tell you later why I choose Precisions, because actually with Alberti and Palladio and Durand, it's very easy to decide what is the book that we're identifying as this discourse of a particular subject, while Corbu wrote many different books through his life, and I'm actually selecting Precisions for specific reasons. So now I'm illustrating for you this particular notion that I'm trying to elucidate today, discuss today, of the architectural signifier. And in particular, with the idea that the signifier doesn't work, the architectural signifier doesn't work at all like the simple linguistic signifier, this unit composed by two sides, the signifier, the sound image, or the signified, the concept that is adhered to that signifier. And as I mentioned here, I'm talking about, first of all, a relative autonomy of the signifier with respect to the signified. In this case, the signified is column, but you could see that the signifier, actually I'm representing with a number of images, and that's what I also call sliding over the single signified, which is column, but also I'm describing this as a chain of signifiers. So I'm showing you the column and as the condensation of natural proportions, or proportions in nature, of musical proportions, of sound, of body proportions, of gender distinctions, etc. So there are all these signifiers that somehow make a chain that somehow is linked to the architectural signifier column. Now, for instance, here I'm showing you in a more specific way what I mean by the gender sliding, since the Doric column relates to the male body, Hercules in this case, the Ionic to the woman's body, and the Corinthian to a young woman's body. So now another issue that I want to bring up, but I'm not going to really develop much, is the fact that when we're talking about the architecture sign and in particular the signifier, we are within the what I would call the imaginary. So the imaginary is the dimension where the practices of architecture, its discourse, its design, its buildings reside in grand part, and in different ways, supported, as I said, supported by language. Architectural discourse is what makes it possible to escape the closure that defines the imaginary dimension, which are the boundaries that define what architecture is and what architecture is not. And these practices, linguistic practices, the design practices, have a symbolic dimension as well that can be accessed through the reading of the imaginary. But that's an issue that I'm not going to be discussing today unless we get questions about this issue, okay? So now more specifically about the architectural signifier. The Saussurean term signifiant in French, or signifier, has been accorded an important value since it has drifted from one discourse to another, from linguistics to anthropology to psychoanalysis, and finally to semiotics, which is actually the term that is being used today to designate the field that Saussure defined as semiology, as the study of different signifying practices, among them architecture. Now, to isolate the term signifier outside of the network of latent relationships which constitute its value within Lang could be considered problematic. And I would say that always borrowing terms from one discipline to another one has to be done with extreme care, making sure that we are aware that we're transferring notions from a field where that notion was first developed. So to somehow justify this move, in my theoretical work, I looked at Lévi-Strauss in anthropology and Lacan in psychoanalysis, in the way they transfer this notion signifier to their disciplines. But as I said, I'm just going to mention this before I'm turning back to architecture, because this could be the subject of a different presentation. That is. So, so let's move on now to the question of the architectural discourse. The term discourse, which I'm going to mention from now on when I refer to architectural discourse, designates the manifestation of Lang in living communication, which is, for instance, what I'm doing right now. In contrast with Lang, which designates language as a collection of formal signs stratified in layers, signs that form systems and structures, discourse implies, first of all, the participation of the subject as an individual, in this case, myself. Using the anonymous structure of Lang, the subject transforms himself or herself in the discourse he communicates to the other. The Lang, the Saussurean system, becomes in discourse the vehicle of a unique message. I'm obviously using English now, the English language. This message belongs to the particular structure of a given subject, me, who imprints a specific seal on the structure of language. The term discourse designates any enunciation that integrates in its structure the speaker and the listener, that's you, with the desire of the former to influence the latter. Actually, in this case, the influence would be perhaps to provoke questions when I finish my discourse. So now I want to refer to what I suggested, 4 architectural moments defined by 4 discourses, by 4 different conceptions of the sign, of the signifier, and the subject. I would risk naming them 4 successive foundations of the discipline of architecture and its practice. So first, Alberti, and I'm showing you the cover of one of the earliest versions of Alberti when it was, of the Alberti 10 books, when it was translated to Italian. Here in this version, it says tradotta in lingua fiorentina. So it's the language that was spoken in Florence, which wasn't even considered Italian, because Italy didn't exist. So, so first, through the definition of its subject, the architect, okay, he produces a radical break with respect to the arts of his time, and proposes the architect in the following way. Proposes architecture as a signifying practice, and it defines it through the definition of its subject, which is the architect. So, and he says, for it's not the carpenter or the joiner, the manual operator, being no more than an instrument to the architect, who by sure art and method is able both with thought and invention to complete those works with the greatest beauty. And to be able to do that, he has to have an insight into the noblest and most curious sciences. Him I call an architect. So what Alberti is proposing is that the architect works with his mind and not with his hands. And so therefore he works in what I call the imaginary dimension. He works in this dimension with art and method, with thought and invention. And he's looking for achieve the greatest beauty, which requires the knowledge of various arts. Therefore, architecture is defined as a complex system that articulates different disciplines and involves different substances, written words, drawings, and buildings. Now, so the definition, as I mentioned before, through this tripartite system of differences, is seen as the articulation of a discourse where the system is defined, a practice of design where the object of architecture will be conceived and developed, and the design itself intended to perform as the equivalent of a musical score that will be the basis of a practice of construction. I'm using the musical metaphor. You know what the musicians, when they compose a symphony, they write it down in a score, and then that score is performed in practice. So I'm comparing the work of the architect, the drawings he produces, and as to the musical score, which is intended to be materialized in a three-dimensional material building. The system is defined as a closed structure with an internal organization of a finite number of elements derived from the reading of Roman ruins of different levels. There are units that can be subdivided in smaller units. You can see what I mentioned, the column, but there are many different parts to it that are definitely smaller than the unit column, the shaft of the column itself. Rules for their selection and combination into larger units that are brought together through an interdiscursive process and a chain of signifiers drifting through, for instance, music. So Alberti discussed the correspondence of musical intervals and architectural proportions. He says the numbers by means of which the agreement of sounds affect our ear, blah, blah, are the same which please our eyes. So he establishes there an equivalence between sounds and the visuals. And then he says very explicitly that we shall borrow all our rules for harmonic relationships from the musicians. And he then proceeds to suggest the same about, so this is one of the diagrams showing the proportions and the musical scale that will be transported to architecture. He also says from those parts, we also are going to borrow from those particular things in nature where nature shows herself most relevant and complete. And this will be an example of the type of proportional series that the architect might borrow for his work. And then finally, for instance, or not finally, because there are many other possibilities for borrowings, a building should mirror the proportions of the human body. And in fact, he's talking about borrowing from the man's body. And then with all these different rules, the architect can proceed with specific selections and combinations to bring them together into what he calls the body of the building. So the architect is giving a limited agency, sort of like an orchestra director, that will attempt to create through this process a harmonious whole. I'm showing you the proportional and the different geometric, I would say, substratum of this facade by Alberti. Now, let's move on to the second moment, and that's Palladio and his discourse and the book in the 4 books of architecture. So here, as you know, in Palladio, the villas, in his villas, he proposes a process of transformation within an established type. I proposed once the comparison with Chomsky's conception of competence as the subject knowledge of the structure of language that provides the basis for his capacity to generate an infinite number of sentences. In this case, in Palladio, we could say the villa type would be the equivalent of Chomsky's sentences. And here you see a sampler of a transformation of the villa signifier. So this is what we could call the floating signifier. I mean, there is only one signified villa, exceeds obviously the signified. Potentially infinite number of signifiers are representing the subject, Palladio, for a single signified the villa, because in a way, all these multiple signifiers represent to us Palladio's discourse. And since there is a dissymmetry between the multiple signifiers and the signified, they seem to slide over the signified. I mean, they all mean the same thing. They could be aside also as well any meaning. For instance, the sacred meaning of the bisymmetrical church-like plan of Villa Rotonda. So here you have another possibility for sliding within the signifier and perhaps acquiring another meaning besides villa. Now we move on to the third, well, this is the actual building, a photograph of the actual building. And now we move to the third moment, Durand, immediately after the French Revolution and the creation of the École des Beaux-Arts, the first school of architecture, and Durand's manual for the École Polytechnique, which is where the engineers were being formed, which had been actually separated from architecture as an autonomous discipline, and where Durand taught the basics of architecture. Now, what's for us interesting about Durand, about his theory, is that if we compare it to Alberti's theory, built on the basis of the representational articulation of architecture and nature, and Palladio's process of transformation presupposing a subject, in Durand, architecture as representation of nature is canceled. He says architecture is not the representation of nature, and obviously the subject, I would say, is canceled as well or reduced to zero, since the only creative activity possible is a combinatory activity of existing elements. So architecture is seen and this combinatory creativity is a property, is a structural property of the system of architecture that Durand is proposing, and not the creation of the subject. The final shapes are acting as signifiers of functional signs. So here, actually, after this combinatory work, you end up with something that wants to be like a linguistic sign. That is, you arrive to a building that corresponds to a program. Now we move on, and as I'm saying, this is going to be very brief. We move on to the fourth moment, and that will be Le Corbusier at the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And what's really interesting in choosing that moment as a moment of crisis in architecture is the fact that from that point on, and we're referring now to modernist architecture, we have architecture as illustrating what I would call a productive, transformative relation of a practice with respect to its history. The apparent transformative, productive, transformative relationship to its history is a total break, but as we know, there was never a total break. In other words, so this is basically extracted from one of Le Corbusier's first books. And as you can see, when he talks about the contemporary machines, he is comparing them to the Parthenon, which is basically looking back to the history of architecture, which obviously he brings back to Greece and not to Alberti. In other words, architecture has become now, since modernism, a process of production that doesn't represent any sign nor any meaning, but the possibility starting from a limited code. And this is again another example of somehow a productive, transformative relation to history. And this is a diagram by Colin Rowe showing that the break that Corbusier proposes with respect to the past still implies a transformation of a Palladian plan. But now about Le Corbusier himself, I was saying that this new architecture that doesn't represent any sign nor any meaning is starting from a limited code, basic configurations, as you can see here, new materials, reinforced concrete and glass, new urban signifiers. You could see the card, which somehow is perhaps the other signifier that relates Villa Savoie into a chain of signifiers, new subject positions, because obviously the subject doesn't walk, he drives, he enters the villa, and then he starts moving in what Corbu called a promenade architecturale, which is obviously a very different subject if you compare it to the Renaissance Mannerist or the Durand subject, and ends up elaborating and developing a signifying system that analyzes as well the previous foundations of the practice. And this is another interpretation of Le Corbusier's, of Palladio, for instance, which somehow projects a modernist idea back to the past. So I would basically end up my presentation here, and I'm pretty sure that you have plenty of questions, because I basically rushed through what should have been a full 12-week seminar.
Thank you, Mario. This was actually pretty amazing. I thought that you were going to actually do a different type of presentation. I really appreciate the precision and the historical background. I'm actually very, very happy to have heard your presentation in the context of our program, because on the one hand, you know, as I mentioned before, people that usually work with computation, they replace architectural history with the history of computation. And that happens directly in terms of linguistic science, right? As you properly said about the problem of interdisciplinarity, right? How do you translate science from one discipline to the other? And I think that that notion is completely gone, in the sense that computation replaces architecture by imposing its own systems of signification and its own signifiers, without addressing the history of architecture as an independent discipline. And that type of transposition is, I think, where we are today. And you know, at least I've been trying to articulate the relationship between architecture and computation in other terms, and in the terms of linguistics, thinking that architecture is, as you say, a type of language, right? Because there are other people that would perhaps not agree with us, right? And they would think that architecture is not a type of language. But to me, it's very interesting the way that you put it in terms of the precision relative to articulating the different signifiers in relationship to a single signifier, which is exactly the inversion. You see, this is the reason why I invited you. And I thought, to me, we are in a historical time, by the way. I think that your work is more relevant today than ever, because I'm not sure if you are familiar with what's going on with artificial intelligence.
Well, a little bit, yeah.
But, you know, in artificial intelligence, basically to train a network, you use a single signifier, a word that is based on semantics in the most conventional way. And architecture adapts, basically it's the other way around. Like you're saying that you have a signifier, and then there is a chain of signifiers, right? We're actually going the other way around. We're actually conventionalizing architecture by the function of computation in artificial intelligence through tagging biases that are cultural eliminations of the dimension of architecture, replaced by conventional understanding of what architecture is supposed to be by people that are not architects, that are computational software designers and so on. So I think that I'm like very enthusiastic about your lecture, and I'm thinking, you know, like how can we take this forward? Because in a way, I think that what you presented is not only very important to have it on record, but it's extremely relevant today. So I just really appreciate what you did.
Well, I must say that before developing this presentation, I thought about what you told me about your interests. And, you know, this is definitely not what I presented. I mean, I mean, there is only a start. My 50-year-old paper, the Architectural Signifier, is not exactly what I presented today. That was, let's say, a pretext to jumpstart what I did today. And actually that paper related to my first question, that is the tripartite nature of the architectural sign. Okay. Now, I also want to clarify something. I'm never using the term is in general. That is, I basically always say that the different signifying systems of architecture have been constructed and are being constructed. And then within each of those systems is where we can actually talk about is. I don't know if you follow what I'm saying, okay? So for me, there isn't an architectural language. There is a desire for language, and that's why we construct these systems. And there is a desire for language because we want architecture to be to become always a signifying practice. So, and that's why we spend so much time talking. Okay. So anyway, so this will be a clarification, which for me is quite important. Now, I thought that, as I'm saying, I thought of you and your particular angle, the particular way in which you frame computing in a more theoretical way. And that's why I wanted to present this, which is obviously my own historization of signifying systems in architecture. I suppose that you could come up with a different way of looking at them, but obviously this particular way of historicism relates to the aim to look for different what would I say, configurations of signifying or modes of signifying systems in architecture. That is, and that's why I compare Alberti to, or let's say Durand to almost to de Saussure, or Palladio to Chomsky. While in fact, Alberti, it's really a very special situation, because I would say he goes beyond, in my view, beyond Palladio and Durand. So anyway, but that's subject of a different discussion. But and that's why I also bring up the issue of the metaphor of music and the music composer and the musical performer when I talk about the architect as a designer and the actual building, which is obviously a dimension where architects had very little to do, except these days, when you actually can fabricate directly pieces of the building. So that obviously opens up a completely different way of looking into architecture and in the positioning of the subject, because it's not, the subject is not necessarily located or imprisoned in an architectural office, but he could be in a factory with machines. So all these things are actually new, and they all should be theorized.
Well, it's very interesting that you distinguish architecture in relationship to language, because, and I really appreciate that distinction that you did in relationship to semiotics, and in terms of systems of representation, by the way, right? In terms of the visual as opposed to language. And I think that that clarification is overviewed. So, and I totally agree with you, and I'm actually trying to resolve that in relationship to digital signifier, because that's even more problematic.
It's right.
When you go through Claude Shannon's mathematical theory of communication in relationship to Boolean logic, which is zeros and one, in relationship to architectural signifier relative to computational signifier, right? So I think that it's very problematic. It needs to be theorized, and that's what we're trying to do in our program, by the way, and through writing and discussions. But what you just said about Alberti, there's also another notion that you place as a little bit like playing with very deep synthetic levels that you are, because your text, by the way, I always say that they are at the level of Chomsky in architecture, because you don't just narrate, right? You come to conclusions, and then those conclusions become like really sophisticated phrases that are syntactical and themselves very synthetical of what you're articulating.
Right.
After almost like you follow a mathematical logical process. And I appreciate that, because one of the things that you said about Alberti relative to the problem of representation and the architect versus Durand as developing a system, right?
Yeah.
So first, Alberti places the author, right, in terms of the architect, right, in terms of the thinking and so on, and the concept. But then you said something very important about Duran, that Duran doesn't leave room for the subject. And that I thought that it was great because one of the reasons, the systematicity of Duran, the encyclopedic, right? Like Duran was developing a kind of encyclopedic knowledge, is that reduction is often seen as negative. I see it as negative in relationship to Palladio, let's say, right? That Palladio develops a system, but then there is a very sophisticated criticism of the same system that Palladio is developing. But you're saying that Duran, in a way, lets the system play along, which is the issue of computation today relative to authorship, right? That the subject is removed, the AI system or whatever computational system is the author, literally, right?
Right.
And the subject is removed. But I just, you know, there's so much to discuss, and I'm just amazed about the way that you frame. But I would like the students, I don't know if you have something to say, but I would like the students to see they dare to shoot your question.
Okay, definitely. Yes.
We have actually great students here with us that they have joined us from different parts of the world. I don't know if anybody has any question or any comment, anything that you would like Mario to perhaps clarify even, right?
It's just a lot of new knowledge.
A lot of new knowledge. Yeah, Farah, yeah, go ahead.
So if architecture has a complex signifier system, and there are pretty much so far established systems of signifiers, from a student's perspective or a new architect, is there a way or thought process where I could look for signifiers or search for signifiers as opposed to established signifiers?
Well, you know what's, well, I actually, because there is a lot of echo here, I can't really hear exactly what you said. Maybe you could come, or maybe I know that it's very, Zoom is actually very tricky because you can't have like half a dozen of computers, because then you get that horrible noise, background noise. So can you repeat the question for me? Yes.
Yes. So if architecture has a complex signifier system and there are already established signifiers, as a designer of today's age or from a student's perspective, is there a way, or should I be searching for new signifiers, or like, is that a question that I could look for a new signifier?
Farah is asking a very tricky question, by the way, because Farah wants you to resolve the data science problem. Like, she wants you to answer how can I find the chain, basically, that you describe, right?
Well, you know, first of all, again, I would start with an anti-essentialist statement, because somehow your statement presupposes a given set of signifiers. Okay, so that's, you know, what's given is actually the history of architecture. Okay. And that given, in my view, is very important, and that's why the second part of my presentation was dealing with it in a way that I constructed that particular history of architecture as signifying systems in plural. So there are two issues, actually. One is, let's say, ideological. And when I'm saying ideological, is that because this is not scientific, this is my position. I believe that architecture never starts from scratch, and that you always start from somehow what happened before you. But then there are two possibilities. You could just try to get immersed and continue what came before you. And the other possibility is that you take that as a diving board to the future. Okay, so that will give you a base that's not necessarily implying what the next step is, because when you throw yourself into a swimming pool, unless you are the most amazing diver, okay, there are many different possibilities or alternatives. So for me, this metaphor will be one possible answer to your question. The second point, which I actually, it's also ideological, it's my own view, is that I do believe that architecture, at least in a way, we should perhaps be more precise and say these days Western architecture, because what we're discussing is a discourse and a discipline and a practice that was born in Western Europe and somehow moved then to the other side of the Atlantic and back to Europe, and now basically is disseminated throughout the world. Okay, so what I'm saying is that you know, this very particular way of thinking about the discipline of architecture involves the presence and the determination of discourse. That is no other, there are no other architectures in plural that somehow entertain this very complex relationship with discourse. And, you know, architecture, the way we know it, didn't exist before Alberti sat down and wrote down the 10 books. Okay, so what I'm saying is that in the same way as he wrote the 10 books, Corbusier sat down and wrote also a ton of books. And somehow it's through those books, through that discourse, that he somehow managed to change the reserve of signifier, which actually is one of the things that Alberti did as well, because he, in the book 6, he says, well, architects, what you have to do is, what I did was reread a book that was totally illegible, Vitruvius. What you have to, and then what I did, I went to Rome and I measured those ruins. You have to do that again. And the one who took it seriously was Palladio, and what he wrote was different. And what he drew, even if he was drawing the same object, was also different, okay? And then every architect who came afterwards drew his own thing. But that's, for me, the genius of Alberti. You see, and that's why architecture in the West was never just a language, because he opened up the door for the subject to constantly change it. Okay, and by constantly change it, adapt it at every time to its historical moment. So in that sense, I'm saying Alberti is not like Chomsky or Durand. He's like a total genius, okay, by opening up those possibilities and by being actually even contradictory in his text. So you never know if you're right or wrong, or you never know if this is the right. And he also leaves it up to you, okay? Because he says, okay, how do you achieve beauty is, you know it. It's when everything is in its proper place, when you have the right number of elements and every element is in a proper place, but he doesn't tell you what the right number of elements is or what the proper place is. So, so that's, so that would be a kind of long answer to your question. Okay, so what I'm saying is that, yeah, you know, what you need to do is hard work to sit down and start, you know, constructing your discourse. And that's why, you know, when I advise students, I tell them, and I actually these days, I either initiate students, undergrads, or I advise master students. And for the master students, I basically tell them just, you know, beginning just right. And I ask them to constantly write down their thoughts, because, you know, speaking is not writing. And I didn't get into that question, but basically the productive activity is called writing. Speaking is for cafe conversation, okay? So as you said, Pablo, I mean, you asked me to do this. I sat down, I wrote like 10 pages, which then were reduced to, I threw out 5, and then I condensed those 5 to 3, okay? So that's basically what you need to do if you want to start, your own chain of signifiers. But on the other hand, what complicates things is that you don't need to start with writing. So you could start by doodling, by doing doodles, or by, sitting down at the computer and drawing shapes, with Rhino or whatever that is looking at stuff from outside, or which is one of my problems, right? Or whatever. But then in the end, at a certain point, you have to sit down and produce a discourse.
No, this is absolutely great. I'm glad that you mentioned 2 very important words. The survey, that's why we're actually working with survey. We're trying to measure reality under our own terms. And actually the objective of the program is actually to develop your own systems of measurement, because that's exactly, to me, one of the very interesting differences between Alberti and Palladio. Palladio, when measured, and actually develop a code, right? Like you mentioned the word code, right? And it was not really related to proportions, right? It was related to proportions, but it was an underlying mathematics of relationship between spaces that they stay and they change, right?
Yeah.
So that was, to me, a very important notion that you gave. The other notion that you spoke about to me, and this is the reason why we're doing this through computation, is the problem of determination. That's why FAIA is asking the problem of the signifier, because in computation, computer software, the problem is anticipated by the form of the software. And that's the predeterministic system of signification that we're entering. You have to be very aware that when you work with a computer, I was one of the first ones, I think, to denounce that problem, that you are already entering in a system that already signifies, right? And you have to be very aware of that. And one of the interesting things that we're moving along with artificial intelligence, that's why Farah made that question, is that we're trying to actually develop software from a non-deterministic point of view, like an emergent signifier through an emergent signifier, so that the 2 things are at the same meta level, let's say, right? So very happy the way that you are actually addressing these issues.
Pablo, also, I've been thinking, because, one of my problems, as you probably know, I started playing with computers in 1987, 1988, when Skip Morris and Merrill gave me the chance to play with their system. I mean, that was before CAD. I immediately learned a number of things that I didn't know before, which I thought was really important. It expanded my views. It made it, for me, it actually also reaffirmed the way we work, because I saw the parallelisms, like, for instance, this whole idea about layers, okay, that immediately came out, and it's like tracing paper, okay? So what I'm saying is that for me was really very interesting. What I always had a bit of a problem was the keyboard, okay? Because, the idea that we type letters to produce images, for me, was always suspect. And for me, what's really interesting is the possibility. I'm a PC person, and I like the Lenovo Yoga because you can draw on the screen. So you can actually write by hand, you can draw and do all the things that we used to do with pencil and paper, but at the same time, you are in the computer, you see? So for me, these are issues and questions that are very important because they concern the subject, okay? I'm like, obviously way in my long life before computers, but I basically been always interested in the way in tools. So for instance, I don't know what's going to happen with the continuous development of the computer, and I don't know because I don't play with 3D, you know, the 3D printer, etc. But I'm pretty sure that there are, you know, new options that are going to, new alternatives that are going to be suggested by these tools. But in the end, I believe that, and for me, this is a very, very important principle, is that every new tool, we need to look at the way to integrate it into our kit of existing tools. And they don't replace, they expand, and they start interacting in different ways. You see, so for me, that's a very important issue in terms of a sort of subjective and direct relationship, you know, between body and tools. Because obviously I belong to a time where my tools were paper, pencil, pen, ink, and writing by hand and sketching. And I don't want to lose them. You know what I'm saying? That is, I like the idea that I expanded, you know, my tools.
No, absolutely. Actually, one of the theories that we're trying to activate is that the students, they develop their own tools to avoid the term, because even if you bypass the code or the coding part of the keyboard, the tools are pre-made, right? So in order to avoid that, we're actually trying the students to develop their own tools, develop their own algorithms, and then eventually develop their own systems and their own frameworks. That's we try to expand as much as possible. But we're trying. It's very difficult. It's like a metaphysical project because it's also physical, because we are actually building things, trying to motivate the signifier and to actually create new signifiers, avoiding determination. Because if you follow the 3D printing problem, the 3D prints are images also of ideology, and the ideology is implicit in the way of the technology, and also we're actually trying to expand that notion. So I totally agree with the idea of expansion. But Mario, I don't know if you want to say anything else. Anybody has any final comments? Because I don't want to abuse your time. This has been amazing.
No, that's fine, and that's okay. I think that this has been very, you know, very pleasurable. I enjoy this. So,
thank you.
And and I wish you all luck.
We're going to, if you don't mind, I think it would be a good idea to transcribe this. It was so good. But I know that you don't like speech, and I agree with you. So it would not be right. So then we enter into the problem of speech and writing. But,
well, no, I can, Pablo. I can actually send you the text because I wrote.
Yes.
It.
Okay.
So
I want to give you another. I want to ask you another question after that.
Okay.
So,
yeah, no, because it's true. No, the text, as you said, is super condensed, and I'm pretty sure, you know, it's something also that I consider this a first draft. So I'm sure I would have questions myself. Okay?
It will be amazing.
I left a lot of inconclusive statements. For instance, when I mentioned, I said everything that we're discussing here is at the level of the imaginary. And I'm not talking about the symbolic, which is obviously putting these questions on a couch. Okay. So, and not talking about not what we see or what we hear, but about what we don't see and what we don't hear.
Exactly. No, that was clear. Yeah, that was clear.
So anyway, so that subject of, and then as you know, in the last, I don't know, like for many years, I'm really very interested in the city and in urban issues, and I think I'm interested in how these questions work at that level. Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Mario. Thank you for your generosity.
No, thank you all. Yeah, and and talk to you soon. So then I'll send you this. Okay.
Yeah, it will be great if we can count with the text.
Okay,
that will be amazing. Thank you so much, and we really appreciate your contribution. Actually, huge contribution to our program.
Okay, thank you, Pablo.
Bye bye.